Well, thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you for those dazzling technical arrangements online. Absolutely wonderful. And it's great to have 82 participants, I think, as we start. It's a great pleasure to be chairing the opening keynote. I think we're all muted. Please stay that way and in speaker mode, as instructed by Aaron. And I suggest that any questions go into the chat box. Otherwise, it'll be a bit of a scrum, I think, at the end. So I will filter those questions. I'll filter out the difficult ones, Meg. And we'll take it from there. Just a few words about you. You spent 5 seasons with the Toronto Maple Leafs in the National Hockey League, where you developed the athlete wellbeing and performance department, and recently stepped down to pursue private consultancy work as a performance psychologist. Of course, I had a sneaky look at your website to see that harnessing intangible elements in performance features pretty heavily. That, of course, is of intense interest to musicians as well, believe you me, the intangible. I'm always playing with hard and soft KPIs throughout my work. So I've been looking forward to this because I've been thinking a lot about the parallels between elite sport and music throughout this Olympic year. There are some real similarities and probably some important differences as well. So just a reminder of the title of this keynote, The Dueling W's, a paradox of winning and/or well-being in professional hockey. Thank you, Meg. It's a great pleasure to be introducing this keynote.
Thank you, Colin. I'm going to share my screen now. Give me one moment. I'm glad you're monitoring the chat. So here we go. Blue line, red line, blue line, like a game. So wonderful introduction. I'm going to lead with a question or a quote about questions, because in many ways, upon reflection and creating this presentation for you, I'm still reflecting on the questions that I held to look at this idea of well-being and to balance it with the reality of how important winning is. So the quote is, "I want to beg you as much as I can, dear sir, to be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves like locked rooms and like books that are written in very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything, live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." In some ways, creating this presentation and delivering it to you is helping me find my own answers. And I hope that within the presentation, there's some questions, some ideas and answers for you in your world, in your space, and in that which you love to do. Today's keynote I set up in 3 periods, very good Toastmaster style, working in groups of 3. But in the first period, I'm going to introduce myself a bit, and then context setting, because as someone who's a context-oriented thinker, to provide the details or the inquiries, I always like knowing what the context is. And so I think in some ways it's also allowing for a comparable to your own environment. The second period of this presentation is going to share the work. So I'm going to go into what I actually did as examples, ideas. And then the third period are 8 things that I learned. And then the post-game debrief is when we get to talk together. So I won't be reading the chat. I try to think I'm techie because I can create PowerPoint presentations, but managing chat and staying focused on you is just, it's like a system overload. So I'm not going to look at the chat, but we will after. If you have any thoughts or questions, I'll add it in. So this is what I constantly navigated every day of doing the work that I did. How do you provide the care, respect, and empathy for athletes and support their development, while also fostering the resilience, fortitude, and compete level required to win, and in this conference, required to perform at the highest level in the world? So a good friend of mine who works for a baseball team, they do this with their staff development, and they pose this question. So I'm going to have anyone who wants to, no pressure, is putting some skin in the game. For you, individually, what would make this conference or this symposium a win? Not just my session. My session is just the kickoff in many ways. But what would make it a win for you? So I'm going to take about 30 seconds, and if you can type that into the chat, please do. Okay, so what I encourage you to do, if you have a moment, is to scan what other people are saying as well. So in an environment of high performance, isn't it interesting where individual success and focus is so important and it is essential? And yet I would love for you to keep in mind the thoughts of others, those on the team of this conference, so that if you're in a session or if you're in a dialogue, even if you don't remember the person's name, you know in your mind and in your heart what those who are showing up for this conference are hoping to get, and you can hopefully bring a contribution to that too, to the space. So a little bit more about me to know where I came from in this circuitous path of, let's call it life, professional life. So my background was in academia. I went to Western for, ended up being 3 degrees, my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD in political science and kinesiology. I'm an ethnographer. I studied qualitative research, and I studied and focused my master's on youth subcultures, and I focused on leadership development. So what happened was that as I evolved in my career of academia, I began to look at in my relationship with my students, and I put this because they often called me Dr. Big Mama once I got to be their prof, and I taught in the leadership and social change department at Brescia. But I found that a lot of my research and my work began to show itself of what I really do care about in the world. I'm sure your work does too. When I started my schooling, I kind of went all the way through, not thinking it's my path, but I don't want to go to, I won't, this is not a therapeutic session for myself. But what I began to realize is how much I care about how people's stories inform themselves and how they see the world. And so I wanted to look at research and writing in a way, I call myself now even a pracademic. This presentation is a very pracademic presentation. I was into storytelling and alternative ways of knowing creative analytic practice when I was in academia. I taught in that leadership and social change department for many years and began to get to know my students in trying to understand, as these new generations of students evolve, how to connect with them, teach, and shift my ways of knowing about education and learning in a way that evokes a new way of learning for a generation that perhaps has different expectations. I'm sure if you're teaching, many of you know. I don't know how many of you have had parents text you or email you or show up to your classes, but I did, and that was 10 years ago. So who am I to speak with you? As was introduced, I worked in hockey, and I'm a mother. I have 2 little children that influence how I see my world and how I see myself daily. And now I'm slowly trying to figure out how to blend that academic part of myself into what I just, in some ways, went through this tunnel of 5 years of work of trying to understand how to do this work in pro hockey. So yes, the first 2 seasons as a personal and professional development coach, that was the title. Because technically I'm not a sports psychologist. My background is in culture, interdisciplinary work. And so my experience, my PhD advisor was very interested in life coaching as a way of behavior change and leadership. So I began to do all those courses simply because I wanted to be the best professor I could be. And when I met the president of the Toronto Maple Leafs and we had a coffee chat, I thought I was going to be introduced to the NHLPA, the union. And I said, well, why are you talking to me? Because I didn't understand why he was spending the time talking to me. I said, I took courses in life coaching. But I was telling him as a competitive advantage, I think at trying to understand this younger demographic would give a team a higher capacity to perform and at least sustain a positive environment. I'll get to hockey culture in a second. And he said, well, I think the guys would like talking to you. Because what was happening in the sport at the time, and I'll get to my own personal connection to the sport, is that there was a shift in a very old school mentality, hierarchical, authoritarian, bruiser, fighting. And I was a figure skater. I did not compete, but my brother played hockey, very high level all the way through our lives. And then there was immersion of this newer generation, a more artistic compete level, a more individual mindset, a younger mindset, smaller, more art, I would say, in the game versus what the sport was. And that team in and of itself was going through tremendous change, both in the managerial structure of trying to understand this younger generation of athlete, but also trying to have the athlete take responsibility for his or her own life in what I believe is a greater individualistic mindset of the athlete within a team. So for the first 2 years, I was in that role working with players and staff. And then I presented when we shifted from a very old school GM to a new young GM. And so to Brendan, the president, and to Kyle, the GM, I pitched a role and called it Director of Mental Health and Leadership. He changed it to Wellbeing and Performance. And within that description, which the presentation I'm going to share with you is a bit of the outcome of that description, I thought, how do we do this? How do we bring this into hockey? Because this younger generation of athlete, this younger generation of staff member, and I don't even know if it's their age, it's just that the space is called, what's being called forth in the space. And the people who stayed had been hardened for so long that even if well-being or nurturance of the self was a part of what they valued, the space never allowed for it until now. So how do we do it? And this would have been in 2018. But with any new opportunity in a professional environment, it brought new challenges. And that frog is a beautiful example of the consistent resistance that existed. Now, resistance, I think, comes from fear. It comes from shift. It comes from insecurity. It comes from change. But when trying to create a role or a department or new initiatives, it's one thing to come up with the idea. What I realize now is there's so much skill required in having that idea match the environment, but also having the people in the environment understand why and engage themselves. For me, often I found that the staff were so much more challenging to engage with than the young players. So for me, in the creation of this role, I kind of should have had this slide a couple ago, but I was trying to mishmash all this presentation together. Doing this work was personal because while I was going through graduate school, all through my 20s, my brother played pro hockey. And that would have been in like 1999 up until he just retired a few years ago. And sometimes in a family environment, particularly back then when no player could share their emotions, they couldn't share fears because that would have been considered weakness. It would be used against them. I saw from a sisterly love what an athlete goes through, and not just Mark, but so many of the players that we grew up with had such a hard time, whether they thrived in their performance or struggled and kind of faded out of the sport. For me, thinking about well-being and performance was much more significant than the title or the logo. In many ways, through school and going through kinesiology and studying sport culture and then watching Mark, I really didn't like pro hockey at all. But when I approached Kyle with this role, I thought it's an opportunity to skate into the open space and try to create something for the good of these human beings. Because at this level, like that first time when I met Brendan Shanahan and I said, well, why are you talking to me? I shared with him the story of, I remember being home from university, coming home from the bar, like a normal university student that went to Western. And my brother, there was no word for a panic attack back then in 2000, 2002. He didn't have a laptop and Netflix to watch. And so after going through his Rolodex of numbers that he would remember, he would call me. I remember those calls. So finding that space in that high performance environment, what I told Brennan is sometimes it's not even that the performance is what creates anxiety. It's how isolated it is to be so excellent. And when people think you have a dream life, like some people around these athletes propose to them, that creates even more isolation. That's hard. That's really hard. So for me, that's why I cared. And so a lot of times it would be either Mark who would give me feedback on this role, or eventually many times with the players, my access point to them was different because most of them, very few of them are only children, if any. So they all knew what I knew, even if it wasn't said. I didn't know their stories. They didn't know mine, but they knew I had a window into what it was like. Even their parents did when I would talk to them at the rinks and stuff. So, okay, so that's the background. Now I want to share with you the context, talent pathway, defining well-being, and subcultural challenges. So part of creating this role, and the reason why I'm sharing this is both to contextualize the pro hockey environment, just for understanding, but also trying to understand how to fit well-being into the space. Again, it's one thing to have an idea, it's another thing to implement the idea and activate it from the grassroots. Very ethnography, right? Not coming in from the top, but bringing the people and bringing their voices in. So in hockey, in professional hockey, there's a time frame that the players are within organization. So these would be, well, I have a whole bunch of slides to share with you. So scouting process happens pre-draft, and that happens for 1 to 2 years. But I'll tell you where those players are. They're not within a team structure, but the scouts begin to talk to a few of them and get to know them. After a draft or a signing, and if they come in as prospects, which would be late teenagers, they're within the organizational umbrella, but sometimes if they're prospects that are not superstars, they're in their own teams and clubs playing for 2 to 3 years, and they have a relationship with a development staff member, potentially. Some clubs don't even have the staffing to do that. The Leafs are pretty stacked in terms of like they kind of have 1 or 2 people for every role. And they have a relationship, whether it be video or talking, but some sort of a developmental relationship. It's not super intense though. When the players would move into the Toronto umbrella, which is 3 teams, they sometimes are there for 1 to 3 years. And the Marlies, which is like a farm team, a franchise team, they would be there for 1 to 3 years. So 1 year being a season, 8 months. And then for the Leafs, even some players are there for less than a year. Some players are there for more than 7, but for the most part, it's only 2 or 3. So in terms of relationship building, it's very difficult, right? So when a player starts with a club, you have a maximum of 2 years to gain his trust, support his growth on and off the ice, and provide resources. As a staff, you often have under 6 months to establish a rapport with a coach or development staff, communicate at rink professional expectations, and train the player in how we want them to think about the game. All this is happening in a schedule where every single day they kind of have to look at their schedule the night before to know whether they're at the practice rink, they're getting on a bus to go to a game, if they're going to a plane to fly to a game, to fly back at 2 o'clock in the morning, get back on the ice the next morning. It's a very chaotic environment. So layering in this component of well-being is complicated because there's no consistency and it's highly, highly pressurized. The greatest influence on the athletes' perspectives of themselves are the coaches. I'd be curious to know what it is in your environments. But a coach who doesn't even make eye contact with a player when they walk in the rink can throw that player off, because I would say communication wouldn't be a strength of the culture of hockey. Knowing and open communication and dialogue. I'm not speaking just about our club, I'm speaking about the culture of the sport. Now, this is something that's also interesting to know. Where do these people come from? How do they get to where they are? And I'm so fascinated by different industries of excellence. And even different sports have completely different routes globally for how the greatest of the great get to where they are at that level. So I mapped out a couple pathways for you to understand how, if you watch TV and if you watch the sport of hockey, the guys that are on the ice, where did they come from? And how did that influence their development? Potentially also, how did that influence their trust in a professional hockey organization that pays them? In Canada, youth typically play in the region where they live, their parent lives, and then they develop within that organization to maybe when they're around secondary school. Then there's another level that they might play at, and there's a draft. There's called the CHL, Canadian Hockey League. This is general. There's outliers to this, but in the Canadian Hockey League, there's a draft, and there's 3 divisions within this umbrella. There's Quebec, Ontario, and Western Canada. And if a kid is at that level, they get drafted, they go to the team, and they play there for 4 to 5 years. The team owns their rights. They can't just leave. And they go and they often live with billet families and go to school where that team is. Depending upon where the team is, they could be on the bus all the time. Even the academic component, those leagues have been under great stress to improve the impact that they have on those young players. Because in the past, even getting them to graduate secondary school or high school was, I would say, not a top priority of many of the teams. But then those players didn't have much to fall back on. So if a player doesn't move into pro hockey after the Canadian Hockey League, every team has to guarantee 1 year of tuition, university tuition, for a year of playing. I think the rules kind of might have even improved that they have to pay all their tuition. So some of those players go to Canada and play in Canadian hockey teams. And then after that, around age 18, 19, there's a draft for the best of the best. And then they could go into professional hockey and have a different set of ownership rights with the teams. USA is interesting, and as this sport evolves, now tremendously different East Coast, West Coast, same thing though, you could play within your area for a club team, more like soccer, I think, in terms of you pick a club and you play within a club. The best kids in the US are invited to a US development program. So in the Toronto Maple Leafs organization, I got to know a few of the players that played for the US development program, and for 2 years, they're on Team USA. The players move to Michigan. They go to high school together and they do international tournaments together, and kind of the national program focuses on developing these young, great athletes. And then many of the players in the United States go into the NCAA environment. They can be drafted, but the NHL teams need to give them 4 years of time in the NCAA environment before they can influence and have even deep conversations with them. It should be until they can come to professional hockey. And then in Europe, it's more like the football model, European football model, in terms of when a player is young. And I used Andreas Janssen. He's a player that played for the Leafs, and he's a wonderful person. He plays for a different team now. So he grew up, I'm going to give him as an example. He grew up in Gothenburg, Sweden, grew up playing in a club called Frölunda, which is in Gothenburg. When he was in high school, the best of the best kept playing for Frölunda, but he lived with his parents. Some players, if they play for a club, they move away around high school. Then he kind of played junior pro, and he played in the Swedish league. But even when he was drafted, he still continued to play in the Swedish league. And then when the NHL team deemed him as good enough or wanted him, they had him then come to North America, and his contractual arrangements started within that team. But as you can see, there's so much influence in the developmental pathways of creation of excellence. And in a lot of ways, the players have choice, and in a lot of ways, they don't. Another conversation, another time. Some other interesting details, though, about context. Season length is after Labor Day, so after the first week of September. That's preseason. A season goes from October to May. Players play approximately 80 games, and that's scattered throughout a week. There's no pattern. Stanley Cup playoffs have 4 rounds, best of 7. Championship ends in June. NHL draft is every June for prospects around 18 to 19 years old. Each team, there's 7 rounds. Approximately 250 players are drafted into the NHL. That doesn't mean they can't enter at different times from those other international leagues or North American leagues, but that's the coup de grace, let's say. There's the AHL as the top league, the NHL, the AHL, and then the East Coast League. But then there's all these other leagues around the world where athletes can play the sport professionally. The salary ranges from 750,000 US to over 10 million. And that would be the dynamic on a team. So the players that are on television playing the game, their salaries range from all of that. They could have 1-year contracts, 2-year contracts, 5-year contracts. And that's a really complex dynamic in terms of how it influences team dynamics and decision-making. The ages of the athletes of professional hockey in North America are approximately 19 years old to 30 years old. Not usually much younger than, not younger than 19, but there's a few old boys that still play in the league. The average length is about 4 years. I would say even maybe less, but that's average. 32 teams, and there's 23 players per team each year. This role, well-being and performance in sport, has multiple different names that I've learned. Performance lifestyle manager, director of wellness and development, player care, human resources, people and culture. The NHL itself was founded in 1917, and the Maple Leafs started in 1917. So just to contextualize that a little bit, I was the first female director. It took 100 years. Not joking. And within a staff department, there's different departments like management, coaching, medical performance, player development, media, research and analytics, operations, and scouting. Okay, so a few other points to make, but I'm going to move along. The traditional culture is teach, tell, act. I'm going to speak at you. That hierarchical dynamic, coach holds all the power, management holds all the power, speaks to players. But as we know, learning coactive with is the way many younger generation want to engage in their lives and with those that have positions of authority. And then one other thing that had huge influence was the precarious employment and its influence on staff culture, a sense of team and collective well-being. Staff have 1, 2, 3-year contracts. And a common phrase that I heard was, we're all going to lose our jobs one day. We're hired to get fired. They're coming for your job. Think about your environment, your professional environment. I came from academia where you're great, you get tenure. You might have a job for 20 or 30 years. There's a sense of potentially, I'm making an assumption, peace that comes with that. But when staff feel that they could lose their job any day, and I'm not talking about the players, I'm talking about staff, it really impacts how people engage with one another, how they create a sense of trust, and how they view team. Okay, I'm going to pause my slides because I realized I put way too many. I was so nervous. I was going to do way too many slides. But I'm going to share something that I think is important. At the NHL draft, I was asked to present about well-being. And I was quite nervous because I knew that of all departments, my coming into the scouting environment was most threatening. And it was threatening because I didn't realize it at the time, but sometimes one's job is contingent on their opinion. And there's a way of being in that staff department that in some ways disagreement is good. And in another way, there's like a brotherhood where you don't want to have that person potentially have their integrity or authority called to question. So I interviewed a ton of players and posed my opinions, but then they asked me what well-being was. So I did this presentation for them to help them understand in a hopefully non-threatening way what well-being is and can be. What I said to them was that one day a professor gave all his students a surprise quiz with an interesting lesson. He handed out the quiz, one piece of paper, and told the class they had an hour to do the quiz. When the students started the quiz, they flipped over one piece of paper they received and noticed the black dot. They were told to write about whatever was on the sheet. After an hour, the professor collected the students' answers and read some of them out loud. The answers ranged from a black dot to there is a dot in the middle of the page. The professor told everyone that the reason he assigned the quiz is to see if anyone would write about the space around the dot. For me, performance is the dot. It's where all of the focus is, and rightfully so. Jobs, careers, statistics, that's what is measured. But in so many ways, it's the space around the dot that holds that in place in the moment and in the long term. And it's sometimes what you don't even see. So in my job, I had an opportunity to define it. The first year I was there, I met with each of the players after they lost in the first round. And this is how I defined it to them, because what they told me is, Meg, do not come and do a PowerPoint presentation. We'll be polite to you, but in our heads, we'll be rolling our eyes. And so it's like, how do you speak to young people in a way that makes sense to them? Not because they're not intelligent, but because it has to be relevant. It has to be safe. And it has to be done in a way where they feel empowered. So this is what I said to the players of how to define it. I'd be curious to know in a pracademic way how you would define well-being in your space to your people. So this was literally what I said, cut and paste. Staff have tasks and responsibilities. Players' jobs to train and compete, but we have to have the right people and supports in place. Well-being is an outcome. It's a feeling, a space between. How do we know if well-being exists? Well, our environment allows for emotional safety, creativity, mastery of a craft, feeling appreciated, and the freedom to give and receive feedback. For me, when I said that to the players, then I said, okay, now I'd like to know one thing that you think we can do better to improve our environment and one thing that we could acknowledge as going well. And in many ways, those players, some of them haven't been asked that in years, if ever. It's just not part of the cultural norms. And then what I did with that list is I didn't name who said what, but I took it's almost like glow and grow, and I made suggestions to the organization. And the organization made 5 of the changes right away in the off season to the next year. That helped create buy-in, which seems quite intimidating, right? It's like allowing the people to have, well, it's not intimidating, it's just, it creates a loss of a feeling of potential control, but what it does is empower others to take responsibility to their space. Okay, this is one other slide that I think is a complex component of well-being, particularly in high performance, where there's coaching staff who wants to have a say. There's a performance and a medical staff that are doing medical testing, measuring their diet, measuring their sleep, wanting to have a thoughtful contribution to the players, the component of their life that they believe is connected to their job and help their performance. But all of those player lifestyle, well-being, wellness, human resources, this is a big question right now with well-being. In a professional environment, what is ethical? My husband works in a totally different industry. He works in pipeline work. His boss or his PM, project manager, doesn't ask him about his emotions, doesn't ask him about his personal life. He doesn't expect that has a part of his role in the world or in the world that he's hired to do. But it seems like in pro hockey, I think it ties to control, is what is important for well-being to have the players engage with, and what is important for us as an employment place of employment to know our boundaries, because these players are young and the power dynamic doesn't allow them often to feel like they have a voice, to feel like they have a say. And anyone who's done research ethics submissions knows that that's a really important part of consent. It's just not talked about in the space yet. Well, I think it's coming. So I'm going to move along to the second period of the work, proof of concept and idea. So for the first phase, I needed to think about what is well-being and performance for my environment, and what is creation of world-class excellence. Then it was about how do you increase the intangibles. Often in hockey, they use that term, increase the intangibles, or what's on the margins, these phrases that are common. But in some ways, it's that space between, or the space around the dot, that I believe, I know in my heart, it's the intangibles. I know it. It's just how do you do it in the space? So here's perhaps an idea or two for you too. For me, when I looked at the well-being space, I looked at it from the organization level, team of teams level, and individual level. So I'm going to go through, I know this is bad teaching right now, I'm going to blow through these slides, but I really want to save time for questions. A few examples at the organization, team of teams, and individual level that worked. There were a lot that didn't. And I think that's the greatest challenge, is to know when you cast your fishing rod, sometimes these things will sink, even if you think are really good ideas, or I thought were really good ideas. So the organization level of systems intelligence, how do you do growth mindset so the organization becomes growth mindset? I found a Mindset Monday each Monday was a contribution that I facilitated, and we set it up like seed, sunlight, growth. And each Monday during the regular season, I asked someone in the organization, player or staff or an alumni, to contribute a thought, because I thought there's so many great people in the organization that will never even know each other. And if we begin to do this and we plant these seeds, we cultivate a culture together. It's not spoken about. It's not team bonding. It's just that every Monday in the email blast, people would get this. They would have something to think about for the week, maybe some water cooler talk, but it would be a way that each person felt valued for who they were. Professional Development Thursdays, COVID allowed for this. We brought in, through leaders, this is how I met Aaron, different speakers, because so many people in hockey only speak hockey. That's the world that they're from. That's the world they're trained in. But many have not built the professional relationships of excellence with people outside of the sport. And so what we did was bring people from outside of the sport into the organization. In team of teams, thinking about relational intelligence, this was thinking about the different subcultural groups of the different staff. Remember, I listed the different staff groups. Staff development was more task-based. So how do we grow within the teams? Because each of the staff groups have their own dynamics. So for the players, they had their own speaker series. And when I talked to the veterans, they didn't want professional development. They said, we want to win. And we want big names. So I'm like, I don't even have a blue check mark beside my name. Everyone would think I'm just not just a mom, but a mom on my Instagram. But luckily I was able to find some awesome speakers to come in that the guys really gravitated to, and they led the conversations themselves. So it's interesting. You would think there might not be buy-in. Maybe 4 or 5 people would show up on a call, but in their off season for 7 weeks, 30 to 40 players showed up on their own time. These people are excellent. They want to grow. They want to feel valued, and they helped build it. Doing staff workshops that were within the staff. So this is something that if I was still with the organization, I planned to do. I did it incrementally, but I feel like having it systematically done, say 4 during season and 2 in the off season, some consistent throughout the organization, some specific to the departments, would allow that comfort level of growth and vulnerability that I noticed was such a barrier to team. So yes, I can't change contractual dynamics of staff. Yes, I can't change the realities of pro hockey or the dynamics that exist. But I think there's a way in which you can plant those seeds and they can grow over time. One other thing noticed is that the directors in that middle space who have staff under them, but work upward and talk to the above, didn't talk. Just hockey got busy. So what we did, and I facilitated it, and it's just that teacher mindset, was have the directors get together and talk every other week for 1 hour. So simple, right? But it just wasn't done. and it had people feel more connected and also knowing what was going on. It was sometimes done as a workshop, but even more of a creation of connection. Okay, and then individually, what can be done to amplify the experience of learning about self, profession, and leadership? We did mindfulness training, created some player programs. So what I found, and this might be interesting for your environment too, the gap between a player struggling with their stresses or emotions and texting me and saying, can we meet for coffee or go or meet after practice? That was a big gap. But when I designed a program that players can say, I want to do that, and it was only 4 weeks at the time, that was an easier yes. It was a shorter step to yes without that young person feeling so nervous that they kept sinking before reaching out for help. And in hockey, the language is program. Get on a program, a summer program, the off-season program. That was a very comfortable term. And then in the organization, having mentorship was huge. And I know this is something that takes a facilitation, but for the young players, I know that when the veterans were encouraged to mentor and get training to be a better mentor, it had a greater influence on the gaps of maybe the players wouldn't contact me, but they'd shoot a text message to a veteran and feel more comfortable. So I'm not going to get to all 8, but I'll share a few of the learnings. First learning, not everyone will be a fan. There's a hardware conflict. Some people have different operating systems of what they expect out of work and how they take in newcomers. That was something where I thought, if you come in with a great attitude, and it was naive, super naive. I didn't always understand the resistance. Now, I keep talking about the negatives. There were so many positives. So what I realized is, to generate more positives, usefulness matters. They have to see, the staff or the players, they have to see, how can I use this? And I started to begin to think, will they, because I'm an educator, so I think teaching, that's how I saw the world. But I realized I need to start thinking business without being, not in a manipulative way, but will they buy what I'm selling? Do they see utility to show up on these calls voluntarily? Winning is our learning universe. People's jobs are dependent upon it. If the team doesn't win this year, the end of the year team picture in a year from now might look so different for the staff. People's jobs are axed at the end of the year. And I feel like having that acknowledgement of the space, instead of coming in full bore, which I did the first time, of just even that draft where I met so much resistance. I think if I had a greater understanding of how that impacts people's sense of who they are and their comfort level, as much as I thought I had emotional intelligence, if I had a do-over or do again, that would be even more on my radar. For our environment, for the pro hockey environment, I'm speaking more of staff. They're taskmasters. Their comfort zone is the work that they do. They're tradesmen of athletic therapy. They're tradespeople of dietitian. So for when I was creating the professional development series, I thought professional development, culture, all these outside things were great, but the feedback that I got very early on was, I don't know how to use it. I want to use it for my job. So that's why I circled back to using more sports-specific people that had some relevance, but the differentiating factor was they were from a different sporting environment. That made the jump smaller. Without judgment, just trying to understand the space. And in a high-performance mindset, blue ribbons are not for everyone. I'll leave that slide as it is. Talking less, doing more. And I think I'm going to pause, because I think I'm going to talk less right now and do more into the post-game debrief. Perhaps this reminds you of the minivan that you grew up with. It's very similar to the one that I had after games as a family. So Colin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hopefully some of this resonated. And if nothing else, it planted ideas of things that you could try in your worlds now and going forward around the world. So.
Thank you very much, Meg. That's what I would describe as an ideal keynote. Can you hear me? Yeah. I mean, wonderfully presented, and the content absolutely fantastic, reminding me actually of the way orchestral culture has changed so much, from the conductor as dictator to a much more consultative environment, undoubtedly. And also the fact that musicians are very bad at sharing their fears as well as they go onto the platform. I mean, it's absolutely taboo, I think. But I've got one question that I've been itching to ask you. In European football, we have a lot of examples of people who make a complete hash of it when they finish and become alcoholics and, you know, really can kill themselves, you know, at worst. And other people who go on to have fantastic careers, perhaps in the media, or they become business people, and so on. I mean, is there any care taken for that moment when people stop playing?
Yes, and this is actually where it's interesting you bring the question up, because I think that's where my future will be. I think it's that they don't have a sense of purpose anymore, or they lose themselves in the bigness of what their pressures are. They lose themselves. So I meant to say this. Most of these players don't remember life without their sport, and they were great at their sport because they loved it with everything in their life. They did. A lot of them hate the business of it, but they love the activity of the play. And I think that each league is different, but it's a very it's a business.
And it's over quite quickly. I mean, in terms of lifespan, isn't it? I mean, more quickly than in some of the other arts, performing arts.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to contextualize the age, because they can go, like a lot of the guys, if they end up not being able to play, they're only 26, 27 years old. Think about us when we were that age. That's young in a career. So they might go to Europe and play in different leagues, but by the time they're 32, 35, whether it be physiologically, their bodies can't handle the sport anymore because they're injured, or their life choices, they just can't keep up. They're retired at 35, but the excellence that's required, many haven't done a lot of other things because they often, I think, feel so stressed the whole time. So I think the unions are the place where perhaps place focus, whether that be in the NFL or in hockey, the NHL union, but
it's obviously
you can do a lot better, I think.
Well, yeah, I think, and you know, that's true in performing arts, and dance, of course, has a fairly short sort of life as well. Dancers. Fine. I'm just now having a look at the chat box, which has become a little more lively than it was. And Aaron has. Are you looking at the chat box, Meg, at the moment?
No, I'm not.
You're not. Fine. Okay. Well,
I'm not. I'm just looking at everybody's faces, either their pictures or their names or their images. Yeah.
Yeah, you leave the chat box to me. That's fine. So Aaron's saying, given the importance of coaches in NHL teams, how are they trained? And are the coaches' well-being supported? And who coaches the coaches or other senior figures in the organization? A pretty good question. What do you think about that?
Those are great questions. The ones at the highest level right now probably got into coaching maybe right after, if they went to university, or if they played, then they get into coaching right after. And then they coach and coach and coach and coach. There is no requirement in the professional hockey environment of any sort of designations or licensing or training that's required to be hired. None. I'm not talking about the NCAA or that type of, or national programs, but specifically in that league, there are no requirements. So there's a lot of nepotism because you hire people that you know. There's the same coaches that move team to team to team to team, that bring their staff team to team to team. Who supports the coaches? I would say from my 5 years of being in it, because outside of it, I didn't totally understand how it worked. the relationship between the coach and the general manager in a healthy dynamic probably would be that, but support in terms of what, I'm not sure. It could be talking about things every day, having a really healthy collegial dynamic. It could be more talking about players. Sometimes those two, the coach and the GM, don't talk a lot. It's old school. It's old school. It's really, really old school. But I think it's changing though, because the coaches coming up have some sort of an education, take courses, know that there's a different level of competition to get those jobs. But again, that's in many ways there's a conflict of this is the way it's done and this is the way it's always been done versus here's something new, why don't we try it out? And then depending upon if that coach wins or not, the team wins, that will determine the coach's dynasty within an organization or potential to get jobs elsewhere. So you just often see these coaches moving around season to season to season because the teams don't win. It's not as harsh as European football, which I've heard after a couple losses, they're sacked. But sometimes it's a season, half a season, 2 seasons, and then those coaches are done. It was really shocking from the outside, from education, to see that precarious work environment. And I think that the way contracts are done, for better or worse, have tremendous impact on a well-being program being infused and taken in.
Great. We could take Wendy Forbes' question here. She talks about your thought-provoking presentation, lots to take away. Honesty sounds as if it plays a key part in achieving well-being, both hedonic as well as eudaimonic. So we have life satisfaction in participation and collaboration. What about all that? Honesty.
Needs improvement, I would say, would be the staff environment. Again, it's the way it's. Yes. So to answer your question, yes, it has to be there, right? Authenticity, being able to be oneself at work. A friend of mine owns a company called Eudaimonic by Design, and that's his whole emphasis. And I think that that's essential for these individuals to thrive within their activity as an expression of their work, and internally, even just taking in their work and who they are, and kind of that individuation process, very Jungian, but takes place over time into people finding out who they are and their sense of purpose.
That's great.
Honesty is transparency of communication. I think it exists within the players' dynamic to the extent that it's a business and they know that. But between the staff and the players, and telling them the truth and telling them where they stand, I would say if there was one thing to focus on, who am I to say to run an organization? But I think that's the place that could increase well-being immediately. If these young athletes that are just, some of them hanging on, knew where they stood within a team. Yeah. They sometimes don't get talked to for 6 months.
Yeah, well, I think we recognize some of that from the stories we hear about European football, certainly. So thanks, Meg. We're sort of getting lots in the chat box and running out of time at the same time. Are there, do you have colleagues in similar jobs in other teams in the league? I mean, if you could answer that pretty quickly. I mean, are there now equivalents in other teams to the job you had?
They have, often teams have like a mental performance consultant. So that's the comfort zone for most teams, like a sports psychologist or a mental performance. The Leafs under Kyle, I have to give him credit. Creating this was quite an innovative leap in the sport of hockey. Basketball is one league that, due to an emphasis on mental health, there's a role of wellness, sports psychologist, sports psychiatrist. 2 of them have to be affiliated with each team. So it's coming in professional sport on this side of the Atlantic. But I think in some ways the players are driving it and the media is driving it, because players are starting to be able to find their voices, which is actually really positive.
Thanks. I'm going to choose a sort of general question here from Marion Grace General about the navigating or understanding an environment where this is how it's done because it's always the way we've done it. Certainly conservatoires recognize that, music conservatoires and others, I think. And how can we encourage more open dialogue between change and acknowledging previous approaches? What do you think about that?
I'll share a metaphor of an older GM who gave me a leadership structure that he likes. So I think it's like, how do you do the dance between both? And I think the key comes from the leadership being very, very clear of the expectations. What does that person expect out of people's performance and their roles? It's like creating a healthy relationship, a healthy dynamic of a family, a structure, a group. But his philosophy is everyone on a staff team, not interdisciplinary, let's say. You have your role, you do your role. And if you play the trumpet in his orchestra, you're the best trumpet player imaginable. And 5 years before, really disagreed with this metaphor. But he made it very clear. And in some ways, I've kind of come around to that. He's as old school as it gets, and I have tremendous respect for him because he's clear on the expectation of what he wants, for instance, for staff. I can choose to sign the contract to know what my role is, and I'll get feedback on my role because I'm a contributor to a bigger group, the music and the delivery. So he uses that as his metaphor. Some people don't like it, and that's okay. I don't know where I sit in terms of what I want going forward, because I like the idea of interdisciplinary teams and working together, but I'm kind of circling around the question. I think what I'm trying to say is when there's a clarity of intentionality from the leadership and people know what their job is and they get feedback, they know who they report to, there's an openness at least to talk to that one person. It could still be an old school environment, and perhaps a structured environment of excellence is required. I don't know if the mishmash, like the flipped classroom approach in a professional sport environment would work. But I think there's ways to integrate the new with old, still valuing the more traditional ways of leading.
We've got 2 minutes to go, Meg, and I'm just going to take one question from Michael Durrant. Considering the 2 W's, which, as we remember from the title, winning and or well-being, what do you think are the main tensions that exist between them? Might have to be quite quick, that one.
That if the teams don't win, everyone loses their job. If the teams don't win, the stress is so high, whether it be externally from the fans or internally from the organization, jobs are on the line. So to keep well-being going in those times where performance is the rule of the game, that comes into conflict. It seems awesome, and I think it's possible. I also think that when there's transience of staff and players, that continuity of safety, that continuity of well-being is very difficult to sustain. So how does that dance work, the dancer and the dance? How do both coexist at the same time? And perhaps if it comes from the ownership or like an HR person who's there all the time, no matter the movement and shifting, it can be done. But every time there's a new coach or every time there's a new GM, that person brings in a new type of culture that he wants, she wants, but up until now it's been he. And that could happen yearly. So what is the cultural norm of an organization when there's so much transience? I think that's the dueling. Yet everyone knows well-being and the care of a human being is important. I think in their hearts they do, but how it works in the workplace, I think people don't know. And it's easy to all of us, for me, anybody, it's easy to retract into our shadows. It's easier to fall upon old habits in those times of tension. But it's in those times of tension, it needs to be evoked even more.
Thank you very much, Meg. On that challenging note, I think we'll close the session. But thank you very much. I mean, I've learned a lot. I know that everyone else will have done, and we've got a lot of questions for you. I hope you will have a look at the chat box, because there were some questions I didn't get to. I'm afraid applause is breaking out on my screen, and I'm not really surprised. So I do want to thank you most sincerely, and I'm sorry we're not meeting in person. A really wonderful session, very, very stimulating. So thank you very much. So if you look at your schedule, folks, I think you'll find there's a break, and then we will be starting according to the schedule, which I think, Erin, is in about half an hour, is it? Could you nod your head? Yeah, in half an hour. So keep an eye